fellow students, today we will talk on the topic, the feudalism debate. We will also discuss the concept of the segmentary state in the context of early medieval India. Now, the centuries between 600 and 1300 CE have been regarded as the early medieval period in Indian history. The dividing lines, however, remain open-ended. In fact, the changing patterns during this period have been under the scanner. Polemical conversations still continue on various political and socio-economic issues. This motivates us to look into a major debate of the period. The issue here is whether feudalism in some form or the other had a presence in early medieval India. Considering that feudalism was a key attribute of most pre-industrial societies, we can bore a little deep and find out whether it was contextual to India. Now, feudalism is a complex term. In fact, there is no universally accepted definition that covers all its aspects. As a socio-economic structure, we can say that in feudalism, there was the exploitation of the primary producer by a class of landlords who demanded a huge amount of tax from the peasants and used them for their own benefits. In fact, we find that in feudalism, the peasants were reduced to serfdom. Marc Bloch, the very famous historian who has a classic book on feudalism, gives us certain descriptions of feudal society. He tells us that feudal society had a subject peasantry, the widespread use of tenement, that is the fief, instead of a salary. There was the supremacy of a class of warriors, and within this, there were ties of obedience and protection that bound man and man. In fact, he points out that within this warrior class, there was a particular kind of allegiance known as vassalage. In the end, feudalism went towards fragmentation of authority, ultimately leading to chaos and disorder. Now, in the feudal society, production was always for use, and therefore long-distance trade and urbanization were minimal in this scenario. The classic form of feudalism, in which the manorial system and serfdom were contiguous, remains central to the economic structure of Europe in the Middle Ages, that is, from the 5th to the 15th centuries. Therefore, we may take up a comparative analysis with socio-economic formats and production models in other parts of the world. It would be very fruitful if we compared the European scenario with the scenarios in the other parts of the world. Now, let us come to the Indian context. Did feudalism exist in India? Now, the prolific writings of R.S. Sharma tell us that feudalism did exist in India. In fact, this observation of Sharma's has generated innumerable arguments and counter-arguments on this issue. Sharma thinks that feudalism initiated from around the 5th century CE and reached its high point around the 11th and 12th centuries. Earlier, the Marxist historian D.D. Kosambi had mooted the proposition that feudalism existed in India. But his research, however, was in the context of the 17th century. So let us go back to R.S. Sharma. R.S. Sharma, B.N.S. Yadava, D.N. Jha, and Lalanji Gopal have put forward evidence which shows that feudalism took place in India, or feudalism began to emerge in India around the post-Gupta period. In fact, R.S. Sharma notices that there had been certain very subtle changes in the administration during the Gupta period, which actually led to the emergence of feudalism immediately later. So, R.S. Sharma actually focuses on the post-Gupta period, when he identifies that land grants were made by the state to administrators, officials, and to Brahmins. And this created a new landed intermediary class within Indian society. This class later crystallized into what we know as a feudal elite. Now, apart from secular beneficiaries, numerous land grants were made to religious institutions, to Brahmins in particular, to religious institutions like the temple and to Brahmins. We know that Brahmadaya lands, these were in general called Brahmadaya lands, and the lands to the Brahmins particularly being called Agrahara grants. Now, the Brahmins were granted land, as we all know, for conducting priestly and other spiritual, temple, and community duties. The significant factor here was that when the ruler granted the lands to the Brahmins, it was accompanied by the instruction that I would like to just repeat this, that when the land grants were made to the Brahmins, the ruler usually gave up his right of revenue collection and even the right of governance over this territory. So land grants made to Brahmins in particular were accompanied by instructions that the peasants and everybody else living on the land, the artisans included, would have to pay their taxes to the new landowner and also to obey him fully. So we find that the beneficiaries now came to dominate the peasants almost completely. In fact, juridical authority enabled these landed magnates to inflict punishment upon the villagers and peasants. So they had many demands on the peasants. Apart from taxes, rent, they also demanded complete obedience, and thereby a definitive control over the means of production was established by these landed beneficiaries. Right. Now, by the 6th century CE, we find that these landed beneficiaries had begun to assume titles like Samanta, Mahasamanta, Samanta Maharaj, etc. Right? Now, these Samantas were expected to pay annual tribute to the king and also pay personal homage to him. Chiefs who had been militarily defeated in war were sometimes allowed to retain their lands in exchange for paying homage and paying annual tribute to the conqueror. Now, therefore, we find R.S. Sharma tells us that definitely there was a trend towards the establishment, or a very, very positive trend towards the emergence of feudalism during this period. He also tells us that this period saw a paucity of coins, and he proves this by saying that during Harshavardhan's time, there was really almost no instance of upper administrative classes being paid in cash for their services. So payment in cash was stopped during Harshavardhana's time, right? Apart from this, Sharma points out that the terms bhokta, bhogi, bhogika, and bhogapatika indicated that a landed class living off agrarian wealth had a distinct presence in Indian society now. Sharma tells us that such developments could be found all over the subcontinent. In fact, he gives us examples from North, South, Central, and Eastern India, from Gaya district, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Orissa, and Bengal. He categorically says that this process of alienation of economic rights began during the Gupta period. It intensified during the post-Gupta period and was carried out or continued right through the time of Harshavardhana. In fact, it continued in a more impactful manner under the three rising kingdoms of the Palas, Pratiharas, and the Rashtrakutas. The Palas, Pratiharas, and Rashtrakutas did not pay cash salary. They always rewarded the upper echelons of their workers through land grants. Apart from this, so therefore Sharma tells us that very positively that feudalism was slowly becoming more deep-rooted in Indian society. Now, from the 8th century onwards, Sharma detects a process of sub-infeudation, right? So there were multiple layers of landlords, and these landlords enjoyed superior rights over the land at the cost of the tiller of the soil. So the tiller of the soil or the peasants did not enjoy too much rights. They didn't have all that much rights. In fact, it was the multiple layers of landlords above them who enjoyed superior rights over land. Now, we find a perspective in agreement. We find another very important historian agreeing with R.S. Sharma, and that historian is Professor Romila Thapar. Romila Thapar finds the basic suppositions of a feudal society to be present in India. She says that just like Europe, a superior group of people enjoyed the resources of the land without actually laboring on it. In fact, she tells us that in spite of the fact that manorialism did not exist in India, many features of feudalism may be identified in the Indic space. Romila Thapar continues by saying that land known as bhoga, which was similar to the fief, was granted by the king to the feudatories in lieu of salary. The king expected the feudatories or the beneficiary to collect taxes from the peasants who were Shudras or the people who tilled the land and hand over a part of the tax collected to the king himself. The upper echelons of society pursued lives of ostentation and luxury, while the peasants were relegated to a life of poverty and bare subsistence. In fact, we find that the feudatories were obviously in a privileged position. They took an oath of fealty to the king, and the king expected the feudatories to support him militarily and through other means. Apart from this, we find that the ties between the king and his vassal, that was really a unique bond. It was very intimate and also subordinate, right? Now let us go to another point which, according to Sharma, tells us that feudalism did exist in India. Right, Sharma tells us that from around the 6th and the 7th century CE, trade and commerce began to decline. He says that commercial exchange with the Byzantine world during the Gupta period had been a very important mechanism of importing bullion, right? But this began to decline from the period mentioned above, that is from the 6th and the 7th centuries. There was a decrease in Western demand for Indian silk, and this led to an overall contraction of Northwestern trade. Apart from this, there was the hyperactivity of Arab expansionism, which followed the rise of Islam, and this also created trade barriers with the West. There was also, according to Sharma, the clinching evidence of the shortage of coins in this period. And this was a pointer to the decreased commerce at this time. So internal commerce, there was internal commerce. So external commerce had declined. Structure of internal commerce did remain, but it had to adjust with the emerging feudal construct within India. Sharma also says that there was the decline of towns, right? His first point is that inscriptions found during this period have very little reference to artisans and merchants, right? So in the 6th century, the inscriptions that were found did not have too much reference to artisans and merchants whose status was obviously on the decline. Apart from that, these inscriptions reveal that there were instances of handing over market rights to donis, transferring of profits to temples by merchants, transference of customs duties from the state to the temples, etc. So these were all indicators that commerce was on the downslide. Traders often relocated to rural areas in order to avoid taxation, right? So Sharma tells us categorically that minimum trade and absence of town as urban centers or absence of urban centers regarded as the two defining characteristics of feudalism were very much present in India. Therefore, feudalism was present in India. Now, there were contesting viewpoints against the proposition of R.S. Sharma. B.D. Chattopadhyay, R. Champak Lakshmi, and Ranabir Chakraborty deny the proposition of Professor Sharma, bringing in a subtext of urbanization in the feudal paradigm. They firmly establish that this period had a number of urban centers. Certain towns may have declined, but many emerged in their place, according to them. B.D. Chattopadhyay names Tattanandapura, Siadoni, Gopagiri as some of the towns that emerged during this period and which became very significant with the rapidly ascending Gurjara Pratihara Empire. B.D. Chattopadhyay also talks of inscriptions found near Madhya Pradesh, found within Madhya Pradesh near Jabalpur, which talk of 7 urban centers. He mentions Karitalai and Bilhari as 2 important urban centers within this region, right? B.D. Chattopadhyay, in fact, agrees with R. Champak Lakshmi when he says that organization of fairs, heightened religious activity, the transformation of rural areas into urban spaces, as well as commercial activities centering around ports, led to urban growth. In fact, B.D. Chattopadhyay very innovatively names this phase the third urbanization. The first urbanization being the Indus urbanization, and the second phase of urbanization in India being from 600 to 300 BCE. Therefore, they all propose that urbanization was converse to the feudal process. In other words, they deny the proposition of R.S. Sharma. Now we have the arguments of Harbans Mukhia. Harbans Mukhia denies or contradicts the theories of feudalism in the medieval context. He says that the dynamics of feudalism in India and in Europe were totally different. In Europe, Feudalism emerged as a result of changes that took place at the base of society. It took place due to a crisis of production and due to a need for protection when state power had declined. In India, feudalism came from above. In fact, feudalism emerged, if we can say so, through the grant of land to the upper echelons of society. So, Harbans Mukhia tells us that the condition of the peasantry in Europe and India were vastly different. This was very important. This was very crucial because there were two different types of peasantry in the two areas that we are comparing. In Europe, the feudal lord had an extraneous control over the process of production, which enabled him to claim the labor of the peasant for his own use. This is what led to serfdom. In India, the condition of the peasantry was different. In fact, even though Mukhia admits that the peasants were thoroughly exploited and manipulated by the upper classes or by the rulers, they were in reality technically free, and serfdom did not exist here. Agricultural conditions in India did not necessitate tying down the peasant to the land. There was fertile soil in India, there were efficient agricultural tools, and this ensured adequate production. Social conflict remained at a minimum in Indian society. Therefore, the relevance of superimposing European economic constructs in India has been called to question by Harbans Mukhia. Now, Sharma has his counter observations against Harbans Mukhia's arguments. He tells us that sub-infeudation and hierarchical rights did exist in India, right, where the peasants were concerned. Serfdom was not the only means of exploiting the peasants. The beneficiaries in India made many additional impositions. He cites instances of forced labor in the Gangetic plains. On occasions in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and eastern India, it was mandatory for the peasants to remain attached to the soil. Charters have been identified when the peasants and the other residents within a piece of land was transferred to the beneficiaries along with other rights, along with tax collecting and other rights. There was an unwritten rule that the peasants should remain at the same place, should remain in their villages and cater to the demands of their overlord. Therefore, according to Sharma, the Indian peasant was unfree. Even though he was not a serf, he was definitely unfree. He was not his own master. Sharma here also reaffirms his observations on the decline of trade and the decline of towns. So Sharma more or less retains his point about the role or the emergence of feudalism in Indian society. Now, we come to a completely different model. That is the segmentary state, which gives us an alternative paradigm when we judge Indian history in early medieval India, right? Now, so the dynamics of the debate changes, right, from feudalism to what Bertenstein calls the segmentary state model, especially in the context of South India. We must remember that Bertenstein is speaking in the context of South India. Here, he applies the theorization of Aidan W. Southall, right? Now, the Chola kingdom and the Vijayanagar Empire were Stein's primary focus. Stein opposes the notion that the early medieval kingdoms were the precursors of the modern unitary state, right, with a single power center and political domination over a fixed area. In fact, he denies that there was a very powerful centralized state, which was a precursor of the later modern Indian state. He also denies the existence of a feudal polity who had resources based on the fief and who ultimately adhered to a centripetal authoritarian structure. Regarding the Cholas, Stein tells us that there was no centralized, all-powerful state. Instead, Stein identifies here a core area and a peripheral space. He tells us that in the core area, the king had a degree of control, but in the periphery, he was more figurative authority and received only ritualistic veneration. Right? In the core area, the king definitely was able to establish his bureaucratic control. However, in the peripheral area, there was no mechanism for political control or a mechanism for collecting revenue. There was no standing army either through which he could assert his political authority. So the king was only important in the core area. In the peripheral area, he hardly had any power. The king had to depend on the revenue of the core area and had to resort to military forays and looting in order to gather the resources from the peripheral area. So Stein talks of segmentary state, peasant society, and peasant state. So this is exactly what he says. In Stein's assessment, segmentary state, peasant society, and peasant state, resulting in sacral kingship, was prevalent in the south, right? Stein, local societies of the Chola kingdom, that is the Nadus, Nadu was crucial to understanding his theory of dispersed power centers. In fact, this was the crux of his idea of segmentary state. What were these Nadus? These Nadus were internally differentiated local social and territorial assemblies, extremely important segments in a pyramidally structured social order. These were juxtaposed with the interests of the peasant groups, right? However, which were naturally balanced by peasant-centric concerns. Agriculture was the main occupation of the people and provided subsistence as well as wealth. Stein conceives of this as a peasant state, right? Social relations, however, did remain non-linear, and the peasant did have to cater to the demands of the powerful. However, an atmosphere of cooperation and interdependence existed, and we find that this neutralized the hardship of the peasants. In the peripheral area, Stein talks about chieftains, right? Stein says that in the periphery, a general polity of chieftains were there at the top of the pyramid. They were supported by landholding groups. So in the post-Chola period, these chieftains were supported by landholding groups, and they existed there on the basis of hereditary lineage. This is the very important thing. The chieftains were there on the basis of hereditary lineage, and they were supported by landholding groups, local landholding groups. In the post-Chola period, we find that the chieftains overshadowed the power of the central authority almost totally and pushed segmentation upwards to the non-fertile plains of peninsular India. So in Stein's view, the Chola state with an overarching authority over the entire kingdom was a myth, actual power had devolved on the local chieftains, on local bodies, and peasant society. Now, there were counter-arguments again against this. So reservations and counter-arguments have been there as responses to Stein's theorization. The major points against this alternative approach was that though the power, the supremacy of the Chola state had been exaggerated somewhat, Stein was undermining the phenomenal success of the dynasty in the political and military spheres. Moreover, historians have pointed out, and this is very important, that Chola kingship was never sacral by any stretch of imagination. Too much emphasis had been laid by Stein on the peasant as the primary axis in the social, economic, and cultural format of South India in early medieval times. Stein, in fact, tells us he kind of acknowledges the existence of the caste system and of segregation. But at the same time, he talks about a Brahmin-peasant nexus based on self-interest. This has been regarded with skepticism by historians. So, what we find is that Stein chose to ignore the role of kings, of chieftains in the urban areas, and merchants and other urban categories here, right? Herbans Mukhia raises questions about the class character of this state that Stein is talking about, while B.D. Chattopadhyay wonders where the Samantas fit into this lineage-based political construct that Stein has devised, right? Keshavan Velutat opts for feudalism as systemic to South Indian society. And Noboru Karashima rejects both the feudal and the segmented state models. He asserts the build-up of the centralized state, a powerful centralized state by the Cholas. So we can say this conversation remains inconclusive. However, a very meticulous perusal of the arguments for and against these two theorizations give us very important insights to society, economy, and to a certain extent, the culture of India in early medieval times. This is definitely very beneficial for students. Thank you.